Early here, July 10th, 11th of July, there's a major shift of energy where two planets will change signs in the same day. Mars moves into Virgo, and then shortly later, Mercury will come into Leo. And so there's a shift here that I think we want to dive into in this video, try to examine how these changes may impact this milieu that we're in, this planetary astrological milieu. Stay tuned. Mars into Virgo, Mercury into Leo, coming right up. All right, this is S.J. Anderson. Glad you're here. This is my astrology YouTube channel. We're going to break down some astrology today, as I do on this channel. There's a core idea in our astrology that I've seen to be very, very fundamental, which is the ingresses of planets into signs and how important that is for everything. You can feel it often in the mundane level. A planet will enter a sign and then the whole world changes, like in March 2020 when Saturn entered Aquarius. Really to the day almost, we have lockdowns that emerge, and that's so emblematic of Aquarius and Saturn. It's a core part of that planetary signature. You see it with Jupiter a lot. It'll change signs and all of a sudden, boom, there's an explosion of Jupiterian. This happened a lot during COVID years. Jupiter would change signs and like the lockdowns would change or the policies would change around who and what was allowed out and things like that. It was really direct with these Jupiter ingresses often. So always paying attention to planetary ingresses. It's a key core concept. Always do it. And if you're using a house system, a whole sign houses, the one that I use, it means that when a planet ingresses into a new sign, you also get a new house topic that planet saturates in and expresses through. I read a lot of charts. I see it over and over and over again. The ingress into a new sign brings the house topics of that sign in a nativity to the forefront. So it's a powerful technique, and that's why I'm making this video, because we're about to experience two of those right in the same little pocket of time. So let's look at it. And so the first thing I want to just bring up is a chart of 11 July 1535 UTC. This is Mars in Virgo now, Mercury in Leo. And by this time on the 11th, you will have both of the planets ingressed. And you can see here, Mercury enters Leo. It joins Venus in Leo pretty late in the tooth. This Venus is about to station retrograde 12 days from the moment here that we're looking at on 11 July. It's a big vibe shift with these two planets entering new signs. And Mars leaves Leo and abandons Venus and now enters Virgo. And so there's a certain, and that's big, right? Venus and Mars aren't co-present anymore. So there might be an edge that's taken off. The thing about Mars, now that it is in Virgo, it gets a new lord. It gets a new domicile lord and an exaltation lord. Both in the case of Virgo are Mercury. So Mars now depends on Mercury, filters through Mercury in Leo, rather than filtering through the Sun in Cancer. And that's a major change, or the Sun in Gemini. When Mars was in Leo, it was ruled by the Sun in Gemini, then the Sun in Cancer. Now Mars will express through that Mercury. This is the thing about rulership. This is why it's so important. Because you might on the one hand say, well, Mars is now out of Leo. It's done with the story of Mars in Leo, or the story of the Sun in Cancer. When in fact, by rulership, we understand that this is a continuity moment as well. So while there's a major change, I think the factual transactions that we're navigating remain. There's something that's ongoing here that we're still building in with these stories. And it's just a kind of chapter change within a larger story, because Mars is now ruled by Mercury, but you're back in Leo. So Mars's expression does not escape Leo. Again, the expression of Mars ultimately doesn't escape the Sun in Cancer. By domicile rulership, you're in this, you get back to the Sun in Cancer. And so let's dive a little bit deeper, because there's a few subtle shifts here that happen over the course of these transits and over the course of this period of time that I want to elucidate. What might this mean? It might just mean that your Mars and Venus story, that all of that action that emerged continues now with just a new phase. Maybe there's relationships that were triggered and now it's shifting into new styles of that relating. And it's a very mercurial focused style now, or more mercurial than it's been. So let's break down the dates in more detail. You can start out and look at Mercury in Leo, 11 July. That's what the chart we were just looking at. Mars in Virgo, 10 July. 1340 Central European time is when Mars will enter Virgo. And then almost, 18 hours later, Mercury follows and enters Leo. And so while Mars and Venus did that dance in Leo, Mercury will be close to Venus now in ruling Mars. We're brought back into now a Mercury-Venus combination rather than a pure Mars-Venus explosion of fire and passion. It's now more subtle, more analytical, more communicative, more thought-oriented, more detail-oriented, rather than that pure passion play. And I have here, it's rather than heat and action, it's more cerebral, reflective, analytical, and more processing events. And so that might be one way to look at this. I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks. June was quite explosive. A lot of events happened, a lot of intensities. Now maybe it's this phase of process and Mercury, analyzing, thought form, process, digest, all of those key Mercury terms come into play. And just coming up a little bit more on these dates, you can see Mercury will enter Virgo on 28 July and join Mars there. They will have a month together, Mars and Mercury in Virgo. And so when we talk here in a second about Mars and Virgo and that combination, that gets even more intensified in the month of August. And then Mars will finally enter Libra on 27 August. So by the time Mercury enters Virgo and then abandons Venus, there is no more Mercury or Mars, and Venus is retrograde. I think Venus will become de-emphasized in a certain way then, and it's a lot of Mars, Mercury, and Virgo for August. And then we're in that review phase with Venus and all the Leo stuff that's about purifying Venus and reviewing and the past and the waiting and the delays and the deep inner work. But we'll have that Mars, Mercury, and Virgo power simultaneously. So keep that in mind, this idea of this reflective processing of heat and action, that will peak here in August more than maybe it is now. So we got to dig deeper here. What's Virgo? It's a primary sign. It emerges now on the center stage here. And I want to bring in Stephen Arroyo's Chart Interpretation Handbook. I always like to add text. This is one I like. It's his ideas about what these symbols mean and his creative combining of symbols. That's what astrologers do. We combine symbol sets and we make meaning. He comes here, and I want to just read his section on Mars and Virgo. Ability to work hard and vigorously with practical intelligence. And that's what I want to focus on here. The other thing he said is that an underlying need to serve influences the physical energy and the willpower. I'm not so sure about the Virgo service idea. I mean, we're dealing with Mercury, the moon, and Venus as primary rulers. And those are combinations about what I think about practical intelligence around the material form of the body and the pleasures and trying to make things work around us. Virgo is the farmer. That's what I always like, because the constellation, you have Virgo goddess holding that sheath of wheat. That's where Spica is, the fixed star. There's something here about the detail orientation of a farmer. If you think about farmers, what do? They are very meticulous and persnickety and all of that about how they have to plant their fields. I mean, if you're going to build any kind of field planting or anything like that, it's not something you just throw seeds blindly and then just hope that the food comes. I mean, you have to build the mounds and layer in the irrigation systems and measure the distance and get special tools that you even make to put seeds in the ground. So that's the kind of Mercury energy we're talking about. We're focused on the material environment around us and trying to utilize our analytical and detail orientation, sort of make function the materiality. Mars is a planet of action. It's a planet of tool-based action. All of the building and doing that Mars can imply. And so we're here now with a farmer mentality, but we're with the force of action. And so this might be a great time to prune, to do farming, gardening, all of those things, even work around the home here during the summer. Maybe you want to do summer purges or summer reorganization or cleansing or clearing or cleaning or building things. Like a great summer project could be wonderful. So we're combining the powerful force, which is Mars, with the quite productive sowing, reaping, planning nature of Mercury and the analytical measurement side of that. And so when you come back to Arroyo's definition, ability to work hard and vigorously with practical intelligence, that's where I think he's getting at ultimately. It's the materiality and bringing from that materiality the things that can support us. The other side of Mars-Mercury combinations, and we're here with Mars in Virgo for now a long time until the end of August, remember, and then Mercury comes to Virgo and joins Mars, ruling Mars this whole time, but joins Mars in Virgo, was at the end of July, and for a month until Mars leaves, Mercury will be there. We have a whole Mercury retrograde in Virgo too. I'm not going to talk about that here, but keep that in mind. Everything I'm describing gets reviewed and underlined with that Mercury retrograde. But Mars-Mercury combinations can be trickery as a weapon. It's our weaponry, our warfare, that is Mars. And you might just think about in modern, in modern life, it's not war all the time, like Bukowski said often. You can think about reality that way, but we're often kind of not as martial, not as engaged. But when we engage in our lives, out in the world, whatever battles, whatever little disagreements, or whatever sort of competitions you're involved in, we use the weapon right now, because Mars is in Virgo, the Mercury-style weapons: trickery, guile, subterfuge, strategization, all kinds of stratagems, thought forms, letters, missives, the disguises. These are all Mercury ways of doing warfare. Camouflage itself is Mars in Virgo, because you're disguising your troops with things that blend them into the natural environment. It's the perfect Mars-Mercury combination, I think. It's the perfect thing to reflect that energy. Here's what I have here: farmers' tools as weapons. I just put that into Brave browser, and they have this nice summarizer now. Farm tools such as scythes and pitchforks have been used as weapons by those who could not afford or did not have access to more expensive weapons such as pikes, swords, and later guns. And so it's thinking about like all of those Mercury skills. How can you then deploy them when you need to in whatever engagement you're involved in? And it all depends on the specific transaction facts, but let's say you've been in a relationship. I want to come back to that because Mars and Venus were in Leo. Those were the two relationship planets together. And you triggered up this passionate, relationship, or just whatever. It doesn't have to be romantic or erotic, friends or passionate connection with someone or something. And now it may be waning. And instead of the initial bursts that were on the scene, it's now more flowing from that, or using those bursts of energy to review and analyze, right? That's Venus retrograde. But then also, how would you engage in a relationship using Mercury skills as the way you act? You might want to write emails to each other, write letters, express yourself, go to coffee. Maybe you're out partying with people or something and having more fun-oriented experience in June. And now we come to July and August, and it's like that coffee date, or that taking someone out to a dinner where you can meet, talk to people like over a dinner. I love the idea of dinners. We used to do that a lot in my family, like once a week. All the family that lived in the area, you'd come and just sit and everybody would talk. They'd talk about politics. We'd talk about our lives. It's the way that we can communicate verbally for intimacy, rather than something like, you're out traveling and you're just doing things, or a lot of activities. That might have been Mars, Venus, and Leo. So that's just one example. I mean, your specific situation is different, but think about Mercury skills for action as it relates to whatever emerged relationally, as just one example. And again, I go back to the idea of disguise and subterfuge. Relationships are all about, sharing who we are and intimacy. We let people in to see us, and there might be, vulnerability and playing with that, and how much do you show, and all of this style of interaction is more of a Mercurial Virgoan model than that pure Leo passion energy. Okay, and I want to come back in, look at a few more charts and some timing. This cerebral model of action deepens because Mercury will eventually enter Virgo, like I've talked about, and then have a full retrograde there. But again, and this is a key point to understand, Mercury and Mars refrain from perfecting a conjunction, just like Venus and Mars refrained from perfecting a conjunction. Venus got close to Mars, then slowed, and then will station retrograde. Same's going to happen with Mercury and Mars. Mercury will get close to Mars, slow, about 3 degrees, and then stop and go backward. They won't meet. And so what it means is that some of this Mercurial style action doesn't quite complete here. And I think this fact of 2 Refranation aspects with Mars this summer is telling us something about the year 2023. And it's telling us that we might be waiting until November, when Mars is purified in the heart of the Sun in Scorpio, for a lot of the fruits of this year to bear out. A lot of this farming and relational stuff that happened with Venus and Leo with Mars, and then Mercury and Virgo with Mars, it might take until that Mars moment where it's purified here in November, I think it's the 17th, for all of this year to come together. Remember, that's after eclipse season, because Venus will be in Virgo for both the eclipses this fall. And so we're not done with Virgo, the sign of Virgo, until Venus enters Libra on 8 November after eclipses. And that's when Mars is then purified in the heart of the Sun. So you might give yourself a little bit of a break here, some permission to kind of feel into all of the things that are emerging this year, and all of the things that almost were or almost have been, and let them take the time they need to process a Venus retrograde, then a Mercury retrograde, until after eclipses, we have that purification of Mars, and then Venus is very, very strong. You know, and Refranation is the nature of trickery. You think something's going to happen, then it doesn't. You might even use this. You know, you might try to understand that things are going to take more time, and so you can plan your strategies accordingly. It's very good to know astrology in this regard. This is another fascinating and key point for all of it that's about to happen in our astrology. We have Saturn's lessons, the pressures of Saturn, the creative confusions of Saturn and Pisces, the waterlogged nature of Saturn there, the adventurism of Saturn and Pisces, right? Moving into the great beyond and not knowing. It's like a boy in the dark, exploring at night in the dark. All of those energies of Saturn and Pisces, the very creative foundations that are being discovered, the kind of scary nature of what is real and what isn't. All of that, the whole Mars and Mercury transit through Virgo, that Saturn story is brought to bear by opposition on both Mars and Mercury. So it's a great time to activate our Saturn returns, our Saturn and Pisces transits. This may be a challenging period, actually, July and then into August with Mars opposite Saturn. It's a big deal. Anytime Mars and Saturn are in hard aspect, like they will be, it's major. It means that there's triggers. There's Martial and Saturnine triggers, blocks, you know, restriction, and even too much passion. That's Mars, and Saturn is, you know, isolation and restriction. Those two things are directly opposed to each other. So there could be all kinds of flare-ups here. And I don't mean the negative project. I think ultimately with oppositions, it's a shakedown. Oppositions shake us down. And then when we're left, it's like you shake a tree. All of that those solid leaves are left, and you have the mess to clean up. But that you understand maybe where vulnerabilities are, and we deepen into what kind of Saturn lessons we need to learn, or what kind of martial, you know, actions, how those need to be reined in by Saturn. So there's a lot of lesson learning, I think, that will happen, and that's a good way to view a Mars-Saturn opposition season, and mutable signs for sure. And just to come here, we're now the peaks with these oppositions to Saturn. You have 2 August, Mercury will oppose Saturn, 4:17 Central European time, that's an AM time. And then with Mars opposite Saturn, that's going to be 20 July. So here in about 2 weeks from when I record this video, 22:39 Central European time. So it's kind of a 1-2 hit. You have 20 July and then 2 August with these 2 transiting planets opposing Saturn. And just know, by sign they operate the whole transit, and that Mars transit is by sign always opposite Saturn. That ends in late August. Mercury's full retrograde opposite Saturn. That's the one where I think we can really begin to contemplate the themes of Saturn and Pisces in some kind of deeper way, where it's more constructive and more deliberate, like even lesson planning, you might say, in your personal life. Things like journaling, things like workshopping, you know, the Saturn and Pisces story as it's deepening in the life. Okay, and then finally I want to bring in, I think this movie is the perfect analogy for Mars in Virgo opposite Saturn, Mercury in Virgo retrograde opposite Saturn. Chinatown, if you've never seen it, this is, I think, one of the best movies of all time. It's definitely on my top 5 list. It is a classic, it's a legendary picture. It's from top to bottom, genius, I think, at almost every level. Jack Nicholson plays the guy Jake Geddes, the famous private eye. So he's a private detective. Mercury, that's Mercury. And Jake Geddes, it's this story of him getting a case. It starts actually with a martial scene. He gets cut on the nose by some gangsters. So it's Mars that kicks it off, and then that triggers Geddes as he goes on this private eye journey through the course of the picture. The final line of the film, and this isn't giving anything away, but the final line, it's a most famous line in cinema, or one of the top 10 probably. One of his associates turns to him and says, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." And this is the final moment of the picture. I think it's perfect because he has to, through the whole film, use guile. He's using investigations. He's fighting with adaptability and wits. That's all Mercury or Mars and Virgo. It's fighting with the wits. So he's doing that the whole film. But ultimately he comes up against Saturn. And at the final moment of the film, the audience is kind of left with this real confusing kind of letdown. And his associate just says, "Forget it, Jake." That's Saturn and Pisces. It's like we might have to forget things. We might have to understand that some things aren't knowable is maybe the better way to say it. Even in this film, these institutions he ends up fighting against. They control the water rights in California, so it's very much Saturn and Pisces as a sub-theme. But the larger component is that even when we're fighting this Mercury, Mars, and Virgo season, and we come up to dead ends maybe, or confusing blocks, Saturn and Pisces, just know that's life sometimes. Sometimes we have to forget it and just write things off, like this didn't work out. It was too much, I couldn't solve it. The guile and the stratagems just failed. And that's okay, and you just move on. Mars will be in Scorpio, remember, soon, trining Saturn and Pisces in November where it's purified. Then we can maybe maneuver in a much more compelling way against Saturn and Pisces with Mars. So that's another major point here. If things get blocked out, July, August, just what I was saying earlier, wait till November, because those two planets then begin working together, Mars and Saturn. And I think the promise of later in this year against and compared to the blocks of this summer will be felt very palpably by many of us. Okay, that's the video. Mars and Mercury in Virgo during this summer 2023 moment. Always go to my website. Remember, SJAnderson144. You can see the planets wherever they are in the zodiac. Check those out anytime you're wondering. You can also schedule astrology readings with me there on my website. And have a wonderful, wonderful ingress here on 11-10 July. Both Mars and Mercury change signs. Feel into it. Feel the intensity of it. Just pay attention at a high level. What's going on? What's happening? Sometimes that's the best way to feel into any astrology. It's just with attentiveness. What's going on? Take notes. And that shows you what your transit's going to be. So anyhow, take care. Have a lovely, lovely week. Talk soon.